Okay, so now we come to part 2 of this course, and we're going to talk about scene arrival, the initial scene arrival, and what you need to do, whether you're a medical, legal, death investigator, coroner, or even the police officer or detective on the scene. There are some things you need to do initially when you arrive on the scene of an infant and child death. So first you need to identify who the lead investigator scene is, who is present, and introduce yourself to them and present your identification to them. If you are the medical, legal, death investigator or the coroner, then there is probably a lead detective already on the scene, or maybe it's a patrol officer with the local PD. But you need to introduce yourself and show your proper identification so he knows that you are there for the proper reasons and the authority to be there. And then identify other essential officials that's already on the scene, like EMS, the emergency room department if you're at the hospital, child care provider, who is the primary caregiver on the scene. What about DFS or Child Protective Services? Are they on the scene? Make sure you identify who's there initially so that if they leave, you can always get back with them at a later time. If you don't know they were there or don't know their names, it's going to be very difficult to interview them when you need to. So then you need to explain your role in the investigation. Are you the coroner? So they understand what a coroner is. Are you the medical legal death investigator, meaning you're the investigator from the ME's office? If so, explain that role so that everyone knows what you're there for, and that helps define your authority. So identify and document the first essential officials to the scene for future identification. Make sure you know who the first person was on the scene. The first person might have been a DFS worker, or it could have been a patrolman from the local PD. Find out who the first was, and then everyone else that's followed prior to you getting there. And then, above all, determine if the scene is safe for you to enter. Some scenes can be a very unsafe environment, so be sure that it's safe for you, of course, to enter. Once you know the scene is safe, make sure that it is secure, okay? Scenes of child and infant death get compromised in 2 ways. One, either no or delayed notification. There's been many times that you don't even know that a child death has occurred for many, many days. Of course, that is a failure of the system, but that can happen. Or it could be several hours that you haven't been notified because of the delay. Maybe they got transported to the hospital, they lived for several hours, and then died maybe even the next day. So the scene, of course, is compromised because it has been a long period of time. And then the first responding officer follows the ambulance to the hospital rather than remaining on the scene. The second way that a scene gets compromised. One is no or delayed notification, or B, the first responding officer follows the ambulance to the hospital. Now, a lot of times when we get a call, you'll hear a dispatch call go out for a child, difficulty breathing, or maybe one that's unresponsive. If the police department either, number one, doesn't have a protocol to respond to EMS calls, or B, doesn't hear it as a death, just that a child needs an ambulance, patrol officer might not always respond. But if they do respond, a lot of times then they will follow the ambulance to the hospital. Doing so will compromise your scene because it leaves it unsecured. The protocol should be that the first officer on the scene remain at the scene. Even if parents and caregivers go on to the hospital, the first responding officer remains on the scene and secures that scene until you, the investigator, has a chance to arrive. Unlike most death investigations, the decedent is an infant, and almost always has been moved since discovery. So a lot of times when we're working with adults, somebody comes in, they find them on the floor, they find them deceased, and they leave them there. With an infant, it's not that way. We want to pick them up, take them out of the crib. Maybe we call an ambulance. The ambulance will transfer them to the hospital. Maybe they were found in bed, mom picked them up, took into the living room, tried to do CPR, could not, the ambulance could not get a breath. Ambulance arrived, the child is now laying on the couch. So, more so than adult cases, infants are moved. Therefore, it's essential that the investigator use the first opportunity to locate and evaluate all the locations within the first scene that the infant was at. Okay? Talk to the caregivers, talk to the parents. Where did you find the child? The child is here now, but where did you find the child? Did you move the child? You need to document all of those fairly quickly because you'll have to go back and investigate that because it could be an environmental thing. It could be a rollover, it could be a toy, it could be a pillow, something that helped cause that death. They're laying in a playpen on their back in the living room with nothing around them. Obviously, there's nothing that contributed to that death there. But you find out they were actually in the crib. And the crib is full of stuffed toys and pillows that can contribute to death. While also noting the existing environment conditions that may have affected the infant's death. So find out all the primary scenes and then note what things could have contributed to the death. Okay, oftentimes there are two scenes. There are two scenes. Not only was it moved within the house, but also it may be moved from the house to the hospital. So there is where the child was found or the incident occurred, and then the hospital to which the child was taken. So maybe they was found in a crib, and then they were taken to the hospital. Maybe it occurred in a park, and they were taken to the hospital. Maybe there was a car crash, and they were taken to the hospital. So there is a first initial scene of where the injury occurred or the child was found, and then, of course, if it's transported to the hospital, that's going to be a separate total scene, not just in the house, but maybe even a total different town. Both scenes need to be secured and the deceased protected. Okay, wherever that deceased child is, that scene needs to be secured, protected from people that could possibly change evidence on the body, and we'll get into a body exam later on. So then there's a question about whether parents should hold their child. So a child dies in the hospital, you get there as a medical legal death investigator or even as a police investigator, you and a coroner are working together. Should the parents be allowed to hold their child or be with their child? Well, certainly not until the medical legal death investigator completes the exam. So if you're a police officer then you need to tell the hospital staff and the parents, no, they cannot hold the child until either the ME investigator or the coroner arrives on. Then they may allow that. Okay, never possible or probable homicide. If you think that this could be a homicide, I'm sorry. Don't tell them that's why. Just don't let them hold the child. Otherwise, it's a case-by-case basis. I have allowed parents to hold children. There has been some times where, in fact, just not too long ago, I allowed the mother and an adult sister to be in the room with a 2-year-old child. The child was covered to the neck, and none of the tubes, nothing could be removed. But I allowed to have one arm out and hold the child's hand. A nurse was in the room with them that held their hand while I finished up some paperwork. That was, of course, after my body exam, after everything I had done with the body. And prior to removing the child from the hospital, I had some paperwork to do. I allowed mom to see her child. Now, that was okay, and that's a case-by-case basis. If I had any indication that there was a homicide, whether it be mother's fault or not, then I would not have allowed any contact with that child at all. So then we have an initial walkthrough of the scene. So let's talk about a few things we need to look at on the initial walkthrough. Okay, locate the first responder or lead investigator, I mentioned. Determine the location where the infant was discovered, dead and or unresponsive. Determine the location where the infant was last known alive. Okay? Determine the location where the infant was placed, and identify visible, physical, fragile evidence. So what kind of physical evidence could be there that's fragile? Maybe it's a small amount of blood. Maybe it's some food that can be easily cleaned up or smeared off. You know, what is some small evidence that you might have to collect right away to prevent it from being lost? Document and photograph all this fragile evidence immediately, and then collect it if appropriate. Observe the physical living environment, not just from the 2-foot level of the child, but observe the entire environment. What kind of house is it? Is it clean? Is it average, above average? I know that some houses aren't very clean. but that doesn't mean it added to the child's death. What in this house can add to the child's death? Are there outlets on the wall that are exposed with electricity wires hanging out? What is this environment look like? Dog feces everywhere? Is cats everywhere? Does this add to the child being sick? Is there unsanitary conditions, or is it unsafe conditions, or is it moderately average home? And then locate and view the decedent if possible. So once those are some things you do when you initially get on